"Who did this to you?" the cattle baron asked. By dawn, every man in town feared for his life. The sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, painting the dry, dusty town in shades of orange and gold. The wind carried the familiar smell of earth and livestock, mixed with the faint aroma of baked bread from the baker's shop. Life in this small frontier town had a rhythm that everyone knew. Cowboys rode in from the fields, merchants were closing their shops, and children played near the creek, laughing and shouting as if they had no worries in the world. Yet even in a place that seemed calm and ordinary, danger could arrive quietly, changing everything in a single moment. Thomas Callahan, the owner of the largest ranch in the territory, was a man who commanded respect without needing to raise his voice. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that showed the hard work of years spent on horseback, herding cattle, and building fences under the harsh sun. People in town both feared and admired him. Fear because he was a man who could be strict when necessary. Admiration because he was fair and always helped those in need. Even those who disagreed with him knew that challenging Callahan openly was unwise. His reputation had been built not on cruelty, but on a quiet sense of justice, and that made him unpredictable to those who had something to hide. That evening, as the last rays of sun touched the ridges of the distant hills, a sound came from the direction of the ranch gate. It was faint, almost like the soft shuffle of shoes on dirt, but it carried through the still air. The ranch hands, busy tending to the last of the cattle before nightfall, paused and looked toward the gate. At first they saw nothing, just the empty stretch of road that led out to the trading post and the main part of town. Then, slowly, a figure emerged. It was a young woman, staggering as she came closer. Her clothes were torn and her hair was messy, hanging in strands over her face. Dust clung to her skin, making her pale face appear even more drained. At first, the ranch hands thought she might be one of the workers' relatives who had come visiting. But as she drew nearer, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Her eyes were wide, darting left and right, filled with a fear that seemed to cut deeper than any wound. She did not speak. She could barely move. The gate creaked as it swung in the wind, and she leaned on it for support, as if the simple act of holding it up required all the strength she had left. Thomas Callahan had been walking along the fence line, checking on the horses and the grazing cattle when he noticed the commotion. He quickly approached, his long strides covering the distance faster than anyone expected. When he saw the girl, something inside him shifted. There were many things he had seen in his life: cattle dying from disease, disputes between ranch hands, accidents that left men injured. But the fear he saw in her eyes was different. It was not fear of animals or work or punishment. It was fear of people, fear of something cruel and unfair. "Hey there," Callahan said softly, stopping a few steps away so he would not startle her. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "Are you all right?" The girl looked at him, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. She did not respond. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to speak but could not find the words. Callahan knelt down slightly so that he was closer to her level. "It's okay, you're safe here," he said. "Tell me your name." She swallowed hard and whispered, "Eliza." Her voice was almost lost to the wind. "Eliza," Callahan repeated. "Can you walk?" She tried to nod, but her knees wobbled. Callahan reached out a hand, steady and sure, and she allowed him to guide her inside the ranch gate. The ranch hands watched silently. It was unusual for Callahan to personally attend to anyone like this, but no one questioned him. They sensed that whatever had happened, it was serious. Inside the main house, Callahan led her to a chair by the fireplace. He motioned for one of the older ranch hands to fetch a warm cloth and a bowl of water. "Take it slow," he said quietly, not just to her, but as if reminding himself of something. The girl sank into the chair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Callahan gave her a moment, standing nearby but not hovering. Sometimes the presence of another person, quiet and patient, was more comforting than words. Eliza's story did not come quickly. At first, she shook her head whenever Callahan tried to ask questions. Her eyes were still scanning the room, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. It took time for her to trust that she was truly safe. Callahan understood this. He knew that in a town like theirs, appearances mattered, and that some secrets were protected by fear and silence. But he also knew that fear could be broken, gently, if someone showed care without judgment. Hours seemed to pass, though in reality it may have been less than half that. Callahan made sure she had water to drink, bread to eat, and a warm blanket over her shoulders. He sat across from her, saying little, letting her gather the courage to speak. Eventually, her voice came, fragile and shaky. She spoke of traveling from a nearby farm, of being alone when something terrible happened near the trading post. She mentioned names, but only in fragments, as if even speaking them might bring danger into the room. Callahan listened carefully. He did not interrupt, did not show anger or impatience. He only asked the occasional question to clarify who, when, where, always careful not to push her beyond what she could handle. The ranch hands, meanwhile, quietly went about their chores but kept glances toward the house. Even seasoned men like them could sense the gravity of the moment. Something had happened that would change the rhythm of the town. Night fell completely. The sky turned a deep blue, dotted with stars that seemed impossibly bright in the absence of city lights. The wind had died down, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves. Inside the house, the fire crackled, casting warm shadows across the room. Eliza finally told enough of her story that Callahan knew who was involved. It was not outlaws or thieves. These were men the town trusted, men who appeared respectable but had done something cruel and cowardly. Callahan's face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats, yet there was an unspoken weight in the room. Eliza, sensing that he understood, felt a strange relief. For the first time since the attack, she felt the possibility of safety, not because of force, but because someone powerful was willing to act on her behalf. By the time midnight approached, Callahan had made his plan. He would not rush into town. He would not act in anger. But he would not ignore the injustice either. The night stretched long, but he remained awake, pacing, thinking of the right steps. Outside, the ranch was quiet, but the world had shifted. A single act of cruelty had met a man whose reputation for fairness and strength was known far and wide. The town would soon feel the impact of his presence, though no one yet knew how. Eliza finally drifted into a light sleep, her body exhausted but her spirit a little lighter. Callahan sat nearby, watching the fire, knowing that tomorrow would bring questions and tension, and perhaps fear, for those who had thought their actions could remain hidden. He understood that power in a small town was not always about control. Sometimes it was about standing with the vulnerable and showing that silence and cruelty would not go unnoticed. By dawn, everything in the town would begin to change. But for now, in the quiet house with the fire casting its gentle glow, there was a fragile sense of hope. A young girl who had suffered in silence was beginning to find protection. And a man who had built his life on fairness and hard work was preparing to ensure that justice would not be ignored. The first part of this story ends here, leaving the town on the edge of a new day, where fear, courage, and the quiet strength of one man would set the stage for the unfolding events. Eliza's trust in Callahan marked the beginning of a confrontation that would reveal secrets, challenge reputations, and remind the town that wrongdoing, no matter how hidden, could not escape the eyes of those who chose to see. The night had passed quietly at the Callahan ranch, but inside the house, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Eliza Mayfield had slept in short, restless bursts, the events of the previous evening weighing heavily on her mind. She awoke to the soft glow of early morning light filtering through the curtains, but even with the sun rising, a shadow of fear lingered. Thomas Callahan was already awake, seated near the fire, his broad hands folded across his lap, his eyes focused and alert. He had not slept much, if at all, for he knew the hours ahead would demand patience, careful planning, and measured action. Eliza stirred, her body stiff from the uneven sleep and her lingering bruises. Callahan noticed immediately. "Morning," he said gently. "How are you feeling?" She attempted a small nod but did not speak. Instead, she fumbled for the blanket he had draped over her shoulders the night before. Her hands trembled slightly, a mix of nerves and fatigue. Callahan stood and poured a cup of water, placing it within her reach. "Drink this. You'll need strength," he said calmly. His voice had the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed without needing to demand it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed suspended between silence and anticipation. Callahan waited patiently, understanding that the truth she carried could not be forced from her. A story of wrongdoing, especially one involving men in positions of power, required courage to speak aloud. He had learned long ago that the smallest gesture of patience could do more to encourage honesty than anger ever could. Finally, Eliza lifted her head and whispered, They are men from town." Her voice was shaky, almost fragile. Callahan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in focus. He had expected that much. But who they were would matter greatly. In a small town, reputations could protect some from scrutiny, and uncovering wrongdoing required care and planning. "They are not strangers," she continued, her words faltering as memories surged back. They know me, they know my father, they come to the trading post. People trust them." Callahan remained silent, leaning slightly forward, his gaze steady. He did not interrupt. In his experience, those who had been wronged needed the assurance that someone would listen fully before reacting. "They cornered me," Eliza said, her voice barely audible. "I tried to run, but there were too many. I didn't know who would help. I didn't know who would care." Her hands clutched at the blanket, twisting it nervously. "Tell me their names," Callahan said quietly, without pressure, without raising his voice. She hesitated, glancing toward the window, as if the walls themselves might carry her words to the town outside. Finally, she whispered, "James Harper, the deputy's brother, Henry Mason, the banker's son, and Thomas Everett, the mayor's nephew." Callahan's expression did not change. His jaw tightened slightly, but only in thought. These were men whose faces were known in every home, who smiled in church pews and shook hands at the trading post. They were the kind of men whose social standing would make many turn away, ignoring injustice rather than confronting it. But Callahan had always believed that reputation alone could never excuse wrongdoing. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Eliza nodded. "Yes, I remember their faces, I remember what they said, and I remember their laughter. It was—" her voice broke. "It was cruel, it felt like they had no care at all." Callahan placed a steady hand on her shoulder, a small gesture of reassurance. "Thank you for telling me. I know it is not easy, you have done the right thing." He knew even in that quiet morning room that action was required, but action needed to be measured. He could not allow anger to dictate his response. In his experience, when people in power were confronted recklessly, they often found ways to twist the situation to their advantage. Evidence would matter, witnesses would matter, and the way the town perceived the situation would matter most of all. Callahan spent the next hour quietly planning. He sent one of his trusted ranch hands, Samuel, into town with instructions. Samuel was to discreetly observe the three men Eliza had named, to note their movements, their behavior, and any conversations that might confirm or contradict her story. He was not to accuse or threaten, merely to watch and report back. Samuel knew the town well, and his calm, unassuming demeanor made him the perfect observer. Meanwhile, Callahan sat with Eliza, ensuring she was as comfortable as possible. He offered food, water, and a warm cloth for her bruises. As the morning light grew brighter, she began to relax slightly, sensing that she was not alone in facing the ordeal. The quiet strength of Callahan, a man known for fairness and justice, made her believe that she could be safe, and that the wrong done to her would not simply vanish into the dust of the town streets. By mid-morning, Samuel returned with a report. The men were behaving as usual in public, laughing and speaking with neighbors, pretending everything was normal. But subtle signs of unease were visible. Their eyes darted toward the street leading out of town, as if expecting someone, and their conversations faltered when others entered the room. It was clear that Callahan's name carried weight. Even the suggestion that he might be asking questions caused anxiety. Callahan leaned back in his chair, absorbing the details. This was not the time for confrontation. Instead, he would prepare a strategy that relied on patience and the town's own moral compass. In small communities, reputation could protect wrongdoing for a time. But when the truth emerged carefully and calmly, it had the power to shake even the most confident wrongdoers. He decided that he would speak with other witnesses, those who had been present near the trading post, but had remained silent out of fear. Children who had played nearby, stable boys who had carried messages between town and ranch, shopkeepers who had seen strangers come and go. Each of these individuals could provide small pieces of information that, when gathered together, would paint a clear picture of what had happened. Callahan understood that collective truth could be stronger than any threat or punishment. As the morning passed, word began to spread quietly through the town. Not a loud rumor, but subtle signs. a neighbor asking another if they had seen the cattle baron in town, a shopkeeper mentioning that Callahan had sent a rider, a whisper that his attention had been drawn to a serious matter. By noon, tension had begun to ripple through the community. Those named by Eliza felt an unease they could not explain fully, even as they tried to maintain their composure. Callahan used the afternoon to solidify his approach. He spoke with the sheriff, a man respected for his sense of duty but cautious about conflicts involving powerful families. Callahan's words were deliberate, emphasizing the importance of truth, fairness, and protecting those who could not protect themselves. The sheriff nodded, understanding that this was not a personal attack but a demand that justice be upheld. Eliza, meanwhile, rested in a quiet corner of the house, her mind still haunted by the previous night. Yet she could sense a shift in the air. The presence of Callahan, the careful attention to her safety, and the slow, deliberate steps being taken to uncover the truth gave her hope. Hope, she realized, could be a powerful shield. It could transform fear into courage, if only enough support existed to make the vulnerable feel protected. By evening, the town itself seemed to hold its breath. The three men named by Eliza could feel eyes upon them, even if no one openly confronted them. Their usual confidence had begun to falter. They knew Callahan would act, not recklessly, not violently, but with the precision of someone who understood how to balance power, influence, and truth. Callahan gathered his ranch hands once more as night fell. He spoke quietly, assigning tasks to ensure that witnesses could come forward safely, that no one would be intimidated, and that Eliza's well-being remained secure. He emphasized the importance of patience and discretion. This was not a battle of fists or guns. It was a battle of courage, integrity, and the willingness to stand for what was right, even when the world seemed to favor silence. By the time the moon rose high in the sky, casting silver light across the rolling hills, the plan was in place. Callahan sat near the fire with Eliza, who had finally begun to eat more comfortably and even managed a small smile. For the first time since the attack, she felt a sense of safety. The men who had wronged her were no longer invisible. They were being watched, their actions carefully noted, and their names would not be hidden in the shadows. Callahan's calm determination was unshakable. He had learned in his years as a rancher that fear could be used by the unscrupulous to silence others. But he had also learned that true power came not from force, but from courage, strategy, and the willingness to support those who had been wronged. And in that quiet house, with the fire crackling and the night stretching into a serene stillness, he prepared for the next steps that would bring the town face to face with its own conscience. By dawn, everything would begin to move. The quiet patience of the cattle baron would set in motion a series of events that no one in the town could ignore. The voices that had been silenced would find strength. The truth would rise like the morning sun, and every man in town would have to decide whether to confront it, deny it, or live with the consequences of their choices. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally still, as the town seemed to hold its breath. A heavy tension had settled over the streets, the kind that made even the most confident men pause and look over their shoulders. Lanterns flickered in windows, casting shadows that danced across the dirt roads, and the usual sounds of laughter, horses, or distant music from the saloon were muted. Something was coming, and everyone in town felt it, even if they didn't yet understand exactly what it was. Thomas Callahan, seated in his ranch house, watched the moonlight touch the fence posts and the distant hills. He had sent his men carefully into town to confirm Eliza's story, and by now he knew that those responsible were aware that he was paying attention. But he would not act recklessly. Anger could be a dangerous companion, especially when dealing with men who had the town's trust and could twist a situation to their advantage. No, this needed patience, precision, control. By late evening, the three men Eliza had named, James Harper, Henry Mason, and Thomas Everett, had begun to notice subtle signs of observation. Their confidence was weakening. A glance that was once dismissive now faltered when a stranger passed by. A joke that would have been bold days ago was now met with nervous laughter. Even their families whispered questions in hushed tones, sensing the change in the air, but unsure of what it meant. In a small town, rumors could spread faster than facts, and fear had already begun to take root. Callahan's plan was simple in principle, though delicate in execution. He would summon the men to the ranch, not to accuse them openly, not to threaten, but to allow them to confront the truth themselves. Small towns ran on reputation, and a man standing in the community could be as valuable as any weapon. By forcing them to face the consequences in a controlled way, he could ensure justice without causing unnecessary harm, but fear would still do its work. Riders were sent under cover of night with messages. "You are requested at the Callahan Ranch before sunrise. Your presence is required. No explanation will be given in advance." The wording was neutral, almost polite, yet the men who received these messages understood perfectly. Their actions, hidden for so long, were no longer safe. The very reputation they relied on now felt like a fragile shield, cracking under the weight of expectation and observation. Meanwhile, inside the ranch, Eliza watched as Callahan gave careful instructions to his ranch hands. Every detail was considered: the safety of witnesses, the secure paths for approaching the ranch, the need to maintain calm and order. Nothing was left to chance. For the first time since the attack, she felt not only safe, but protected by someone who understood the importance of both justice and dignity. Outside, the town was restless. Lanterns flickered in windows as families stayed awake, wondering what was happening. Fathers questioned sons, wives whispered to husbands, and neighbors peeked out doors and shutters. The unusual activity and the subtle signs of concern among the town's prominent men made everyone uneasy. Something was coming, and no one knew exactly what it would be. Fear began to ripple through the streets, not of immediate violence, but of exposure, of consequences that could not be avoided. The three men named by Eliza tried to maintain their composure, though it was clear they were failing. James Harper paced in his home, muttering under his breath, glancing frequently at the doorway as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Henry Mason sat in the parlor, trying to read a newspaper, but his eyes flicked nervously to the window every few seconds. Thomas Everett remained silent, standing by the fireplace, his hands gripping the mantel as if it could anchor him against the storm that was coming. Callahan did not intend to confront them with anger or threats. His reputation alone carried weight, but he also understood that the fear of exposure, combined with the opportunity to confess, could be more effective than any harsh words or show of force. In small communities, appearances were everything, and once the truth began to surface, the men would have no choice but to respond. The night stretched long. The ranch hands patrolled the property silently, their presence subtle yet noticeable to any who approached. Callahan himself moved between the house and the main gate, ensuring that the approach to the ranch would be controlled, that no one could attempt to flee unnoticed, and that witnesses could arrive safely to give their accounts. Every detail mattered. Every movement was calculated to ensure fairness and order, not violence. By midnight, the tension in the town had reached a peak. Lanterns burned late into the night in nearly every house. Families whispered anxiously, trying to interpret the meaning behind the messages from the ranch. The three men suspected each other, wondering if someone might betray them first, yet none could act confidently. Their power, built on appearances and social standing, now felt fragile. Inside the ranch, Callahan sat with Eliza, listening to her quietly. She was nervous but calm, the sense of safety provided by his careful planning allowing her to focus. He explained the steps that would follow, emphasizing that truth and courage would be their strongest allies. "The men will be here by dawn," he said. "Everything depends on honesty. Nothing else can guide the outcome." When the first hints of morning light touched the horizon, the three men began their journey to the ranch. Each step they took was heavy with fear, uncertainty, and the realization that the night had changed everything. Even their closest allies in town had begun to whisper, knowing that the cattle baron's reputation for fairness meant he would not act impulsively, but would act decisively. As they approached the ranch, the stillness of the morning amplified every sound: the creak of a gate, the clatter of a boot on a wooden porch, the soft whinny of a horse in the distance. The men's faces were pale, their usual confidence replaced by a nervous awareness of the power waiting inside. Callahan remained calm, seated in the main room, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, watching for every detail. Witnesses began to arrive quietly, each guided by the ranch hands to positions where they could speak safely. Stable boys, shopkeepers, and other townspeople who had been too afraid to speak before now found courage in the preparation and presence of Callahan. Their accounts, small as they were individually, combined to form a picture that could no longer be denied. The tension was almost unbearable. Even the sheriff, who had been cautious in the past, felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon him. He understood that the men named by Eliza could not escape scrutiny, and that the careful planning of Callahan meant that justice, in some form, was inevitable. By the time the sun began to rise, the men were gathered at the ranch house. Each face reflected the anxiety of the night. The air was still heavy with anticipation. Callahan stood calmly, his presence alone commanding attention. He did not raise his voice, nor did he gesture threateningly. Yet the room was charged with the understanding that truth would soon emerge. The first words spoken were careful, almost hesitant. The men tried to maintain composure, but their stories faltered under the steady gaze of Callahan and the presence of witnesses. Each attempt to deny or deflect only highlighted inconsistencies. One by one, cracks appeared in their narratives, revealing the truth that had been hidden under fear and false appearances. Callahan allowed the witnesses to speak, ensuring they felt safe and supported. The stable boys described what they had seen, the shopkeepers recounted the actions they had witnessed, and neighbors quietly confirmed the accounts. Each piece of testimony reinforced Eliza's story, leaving no room for doubt. By mid-morning, the three men were visibly shaken. Their usual confidence had dissolved entirely, replaced by a realization that their actions had consequences, and that the careful patience of Callahan had brought those consequences to light without a single raised hand. It was a different kind of fear, not of punishment but of exposure, of having the truth revealed in a community that valued honesty, integrity, and reputation. Callahan remained calm throughout. He did not gloat. He did not shout. His eyes, steady and unwavering, conveyed a silent message. Justice was being done. The strength of a man who acted with purpose, fairness, and patience was more powerful than any threat. Eliza, supported quietly by the ranch hands, felt a mixture of relief and awe. She had feared that no one would believe her, that the men who had harmed her would escape scrutiny. But now, with the combined weight of witnesses, evidence, and the authority of Callahan, the truth could not be ignored. The town, once asleep in ignorance or fear, now seemed to awaken to a new understanding. Even those who had not been directly involved could sense the change. The reputation of Callahan, his quiet strength, and the courage he had inspired in others had shifted the balance. Fear had been present throughout the night, but it had been tempered by the knowledge that justice could be achieved without violence, simply through persistence, truth, and moral courage. By the end of the morning, the stage was set for the final resolution. Every man involved knew that the story would not end quietly, and the town itself had been reminded that wrongdoing could not remain hidden indefinitely. Callahan had demonstrated that power was not merely in physical strength or wealth, but in the ability to act with fairness, to protect the vulnerable, and to ensure that truth was given the space to emerge. The long night had tested everyone, Eliza, the witnesses, the town, and even the men responsible. Yet through careful planning, patience, and moral courage, Callahan had ensured that the truth could not be denied. The next steps would bring accountability, but the fear that had begun to take hold during the long night would linger, reminding the town that silence in the face of wrongdoing could no longer be tolerated. The first rays of the sun spilled over the hills, painting the ranch in warm shades of gold and orange. The quiet of early morning was broken only by the soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields. Inside the Callahan ranch house, the tension from the long night had not yet faded. Every sound felt amplified, every movement significant. The men who had caused so much fear the night before now faced a moment they could not escape. Thomas Callahan stood calmly near the fireplace, his broad shoulders relaxed but his eyes steady and sharp. He had not raised his voice once, nor had he shown anger or aggression. His presence alone commanded attention. The three men, James Harper, Henry Mason, and Thomas Everett, stood near the center of the room, faces pale, eyes flicking nervously between each other and Callahan. The weight of the long night, the careful observation, and the knowledge that the truth would be revealed pressed heavily upon them. Eliza Mayfield sat nearby, supported by the ranch hands. She had been quiet, watching carefully as the men shuffled and adjusted their stance, trying to maintain some appearance of composure. The relief she felt at having reached this point was tempered by nervous anticipation. She knew that now the power of truth would do what she could not do alone. Callahan began to speak, his voice calm but deliberate. "You are here this morning to tell the truth," he said. "Nothing else matters right now. You have the chance to explain your actions honestly. The town will know what happens, and you will have the opportunity to face it with integrity." The room fell silent. Even the ranch hands and witnesses waited quietly, sensing that this was the pivotal moment. The three men shuffled uncomfortably. They were used to hiding behind their reputations, assuming that appearances alone would protect them. But now, with evidence carefully gathered and witnesses prepared to speak, they had nowhere to hide. James Harper was the first to speak, though his words were hesitant and defensive. I didn't mean for anything to happen," he stammered. "It wasn't supposed to go that far. We were joking, that's all, just joking." Callahan listened carefully, his expression calm. "Jokes at the expense of another's safety are not harmless," he said. "You have the chance to tell the full truth now. Nothing will be hidden." Henry Mason shifted uncomfortably. I didn't do much," he said. "I was there, yes, but I didn't touch her." I didn't think." His voice trailed off. Thomas Everett remained silent, staring at the floor, clearly struggling with the weight of his own guilt. The room was still, except for the occasional creak of floorboards as people adjusted their stance. Outside, the morning light grew stronger, spilling warmth into the room but not easing the tension. Callahan gestured calmly toward the witnesses who had arrived. One by one, they began to speak. Stable boys described the events they had seen from the barns and pastures. Shopkeepers recounted observations at the trading post, noticing unusual behavior and overheard remarks. Neighbors quietly confirmed actions they had seen but had been too afraid to speak of before. Each account was careful, honest, and consistent. Each small detail added weight to Eliza's story. The three men shifted nervously as the room filled with the truth they had hoped to hide. Their confident faces faltered, their attempts to maintain control failing against the quiet, steady weight of evidence and testimony. One by one, the inconsistencies in their stories became clear. Attempts to deny or minimize their actions were revealed as lies. The truth, patient and precise, had finally emerged. Callahan spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "You see now that your actions cannot remain hidden. The town will know. Your words, your deeds, and the harm you caused cannot be erased. This is your chance to be honest and accept responsibility. What happens next will depend on the choices you make now." The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional cough or shuffle of feet. James Harper lowered his eyes and whispered a quiet apology. I'm sorry," he said. "I never meant to hurt her so much." Henry Mason followed, his voice trembling. I'm sorry too. I didn't know how to stop it. I should have." Thomas Everett finally spoke, his voice low and shaky. I was wrong. I can't take it back, but I am sorry." Callahan nodded, acknowledging their words but not offering forgiveness outright. "Apologies are the first step," he said. "But the town will see the truth. Actions have consequences. You must be prepared to face them." Outside, the ranch hands and witnesses felt a sense of relief. The fear and tension that had gripped the town were beginning to shift. The men responsible had been forced to confront their own guilt, and the power of truth, carefully gathered and calmly presented, had achieved what anger or force alone could not. The sheriff, who had been present, now stepped forward. "I will take the necessary actions," he said, his voice steady. "The law will follow and the town will see justice done." His words carried weight, for in a small community, the sheriff represented both authority and fairness. Even those who had once relied on their social status for protection now had no choice but to comply. Eliza, sitting quietly, felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had feared being alone, being powerless, and being ignored. But now, with Callahan's careful planning, the support of witnesses, and the exposure of the truth, she felt that justice was possible. It was not a justice born of violence or revenge, but of courage, fairness, and the refusal to remain silent. Callahan's presence throughout the morning had been a steady anchor. He had not raised his voice, had not gestured threateningly, yet his calm authority had ensured that the truth emerged. The three men had felt the weight of accountability without a single blow being struck. It was a demonstration of power that relied on integrity and moral courage rather than intimidation. As the sun rose higher, the town began to awaken to the news. Lanterns were extinguished, windows opened, and whispers spread through the streets. People spoke cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The story of the events at the ranch and the courage of Eliza and Thomas Callahan became the center of every conversation. Even those who had once remained silent now began to reflect on the importance of honesty and courage. By mid-morning, the three men were escorted to the territorial court. Their apologies, the testimonies of witnesses, and the careful collection of evidence ensured that the case would be clear. They could not hide, they could not manipulate the truth, and they could not rely on fear alone. Every step had been guided by patience, planning, and the quiet authority of a man who understood the power of standing for what was right. Back at the ranch, life began to return to normal. The cattle were tended, fences repaired, and daily routines resumed. Yet the events of the past night left a lasting mark. The town had learned that wrongdoing, no matter how hidden, could not escape scrutiny. The vulnerable were not to be ignored, and even the most powerful men were not beyond accountability. Eliza, supported by the ranch hands, felt a sense of confidence she had never known before. She knew that while fear and cruelty had once seemed overwhelming, courage, truth, and support could shift the balance. Callahan's presence had provided safety, but it was the combination of evidence, honesty, and moral courage that had brought real change. Callahan himself returned to his usual work, checking on the fields, the cattle, and the ranch hands. Yet he did so with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the town had witnessed a demonstration of integrity and fairness. The fear that had gripped the men responsible for wrongdoing would linger, but it would be tempered by the understanding that moral courage and patience were far more powerful than any attempt to hide behind reputation. By noon, the town was buzzing with quiet respect. People spoke in hushed tones about the events, about the bravery of Eliza, and about the quiet authority of Callahan. No one needed to fear violence. The most powerful man in the territory had acted with fairness, patience, and courage. That had been enough to shift the balance, ensure accountability, and restore a sense of justice. Even the families of the men involved began to reflect. Fathers spoke to sons, mothers whispered lessons to daughters. The town itself had learned that silence in the face of wrongdoing was no longer acceptable. The story of the long night, the careful preparation, and the ultimate exposure of truth became part of the community's memory. A lesson in courage, integrity, and the quiet power of doing what is right. Eliza's family, once isolated and fearful, received support from the ranch and the town. Their trust in the community began to rebuild, and the fear that had once overshadowed their lives gradually lifted. The events at the Callahan Ranch had changed everything. A moment of courage and careful planning had rippled outward, touching lives, reshaping relationships, and reminding everyone that justice could prevail without violence, simply through the power of truth and moral courage. By late afternoon, the ranch returned to its usual rhythm. The wind carried the familiar scents of hay, livestock, and earth. Horses grazed peacefully, and the children's laughter once again filled the streets. Yet beneath the normalcy, a lesson lingered. Every man, every family, every witness had been reminded that actions have consequences, and that standing for what is right, no matter how daunting, is always worth the effort. Callahan looked over the fields, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had acted not out of anger, but out of principle. The cattle, the land, the ranch hands, all were part of a life built on honesty and hard work. But the greatest reward was seeing the town confront its own conscience, realizing that even in fear, courage and truth could prevail. Eliza, standing beside him briefly, felt a quiet pride. She had been the catalyst for change, and the town had responded. She had faced fear, endured hardship, and found strength in unexpected places. With Callahan's guidance and support, she had helped restore a sense of fairness to a community that had been too long silent. By the time the sun set again, life had returned to the ranch and the town. Yet the events of those days would not be forgotten. The story of a young girl, a powerful man, and the quiet triumph of truth over fear would be remembered for years. The town had learned that justice is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it is patient, careful, and unwavering, and it is always stronger when guided by courage and integrity.